Everyone I spoke to, whether it was in Kenya or Canada or elsewhere, anyone involved in a judiciary said, those girls could win. And if they win, they will create a hullabaloo of Shakespearean proportion in judiciaries around the world. They will alter the status of women and girls in Kenya, maybe all of Africa. So the suit was the brainchild of a Canadian woman called Fiona Sampson. She's the project director of something called the Equality Effect, which is an NGO that uses international human rights law to improve the lives of girls and women. So when Fiona heard about this, she went over to Africa and she met the woman running the shelter where these girls stayed. This woman is called Mercy Chitty. I'm telling you, she is the Erin Brockovich of Africa. Nothing stops this woman. She's just incredible. And she and Fiona talked. Good things happen, right, when women sit down in the kitchen. And she was explaining that these kids are in the shelter because they can't go home, because they're not safe, because the people who raped them are still there. Both Fiona and Mercy knew it was time to tackle the root of the problem, which was the impunity of the rapists and the failure of the justice system to convict them. So Fiona Sampson admitted to me that it was her own sense of urgency that made this concept take flight. Now, I know you're not supposed to talk about how people look these days. It's politically incorrect, but I have to tell you. Fiona Sampson, first of all, is drop-dead gorgeous. She's got like all this blonde hair and these big blue eyes, and she's also little. A woman my size notices something like that. But that's only one thing about Fiona. She's also an adventure vacationer. She hikes to Everest Base Camp and just rock climbing and she's all this stuff. And Fiona was the chief litigator for LEAF, the Legal Education Action Fund. So it was Fiona Sampson who was taking all these cases to the Supreme Court of Canada, precedent-setting cases, winning them and altering the status of women in this country. But that's not why I'm telling you about Fiona Sampson. Fiona Sampson is also Canada's last born thalidomide child. So some of you will be too young to remember. Thalidomide was the drug that was given to pregnant women who were suffering from morning sickness. But they found out tragically that if you took that drug, the day the arms were forming, there'd be no arms. The day the legs were forming, there'd be no legs, etc. The drug, of course, was pulled off the market as soon as they realized. It was banned in Canada in 1962. But Fiona said to me, it was the culture of impunity in the pharmaceuticals that caused this problem. She said, when my mother was pregnant with me, the pharmaceuticals had impunity. And she said, from that day to this, I'm consumed with the desire to seek justice in the face of impunity. You see, in Kenya, they've got all the laws you want on the books to prevent rape, or to arrest someone who has raped a person, or to punish them long-term even. But they don't. They call it defilement, by the way. Don't you find they often have these tidy little clean words to describe hideous crimes? So the lawyers filed a suit that said the state is responsible for the police and the way the police enforce existing laws. Since the police in Kenya fail to arrest the perpetrators and fail on an ongoing basis to provide protection for the girls, we are filing notice that the state is responsible for the breakdown in the system. And that's what these lawyers sat down to do. With all due respect to the work lawyers do, and I do respect them, watching them work is not exactly the most exciting thing you ever did. So while they were bivouacked in a hotel room in Nairobi, I got in a truck and drove 4 hours north to Meru to meet the little girls they were creating their case for. I'm telling you, it was like driving through storybook Africa. We went by banana farms and tea plantations. We went past those dark umbrella-like acacia trees that are so beautiful. We inhaled the dry scent of the savannah. We saw bleating goats and signs that declared Jesus saves, which were banged up next to fluorescent green billboards advertising Savari.com, which was the country's mobile phone provider. We went by mango trees and roadsides drenched in pink and orange and red bougainvillea. We crossed the equator Nothing much changed. Got a bit hotter. The traffic was, as it was, fast, heavy, and a series of near misses. And then we got to Meru. We turned right down this rutted red dirt road into Ripple's International Shelter, which is the name of the place these kids stay. The roadway was shaded by this canopy of beautiful flowering trees that offered us refuge from the equatorial sun. And I noticed there were fences on the side. And what I wanted to mention was, probably many of you have been to Africa, and Africa just forces all of your senses to get on alert. There's just so much to look at, to smell, to interpret, to see. For me anyway, it brings all my senses to the fore. So I'm driving along and I see there are fences on either side of the road. And they're covered in purple azalea and yellow hibiscus. And I realized those flowers were camouflaging a fence to keep intruders away from this bucolic place that was a refuge to 160 little girls who were poised to cut off the head of the snake at a sexual assault. All of my senses were on full alert when I arrived at the end of the road. The first child I met was Emily. Emily is 11 years old. It was the size of her that really took my breath away. She's 4.5 feet tall. Her little shoulders were not 12 inches apart. And I want to tell you, before I go further, I don't go around the world interviewing little kids who've been raped in order to get my story. I would never do that, ever. This is a test case. There were loads of therapists, there were loads of counselors, and they said to me before, the girls know they have to be able to tell their story, and we told them you're coming, and they're ready to tell you their story, and we want you to listen. So I sat down with Emily, and you know, at 11, you know how little 11-year-olds have a husky voice? She sounded like Walter Cronkite, for God's sake, and she sat with such determination to tell me her terrible story. She said, my grandfather asked me to fetch the torch. I was happy to do that, but it wasn't the flashlight he wanted. He took me by force. He warned me not to scream or he would cut me up. Along with thousands and thousands of men in sub-Saharan Africa, Emily's grandfather has the demented view that having sex with a little girl will cure you of HIV/AIDS. And they think the smaller the child, the stronger the cure. But now, Emily is taking the old man to the high court. Even Emily knows she could be making history. This little kid, along with 159 other plaintiffs, know that they could be the ones who could strengthen the status of women and girls in their country in the face of the fact that no one else had been able to do this. She said to me, these men will learn they cannot do this to small girls. She's a victim, of course, but somehow this kid sounded empowered to me. She'd come to the decision she was going to sue her government. She's only 11 years old. She sounded like a kid with a mission. Mind you, it was 6 days since Emily had been raped. She still had stomach pain, she couldn't sleep, and she said to me in her native Kiswahili, it hurts to go to the bathroom. And where I work, people tell me it's none of my business. This is cultural. This isn't cultural. This is criminal. Thank God we're talking about it now. In Kenya, a kid is raped every 30 minutes for this very reason. Some of them are as young as 3 months old. Now, if a child doesn't die of her injuries, she faces abandonment. Nobody wants to be around a kid who's been raped or who is in a shelter. She almost certainly loses her chance to go to school and therefore to get an education. You know, it could have been the teacher who raped her, so she can't go back to the school. It could be that she's sick, that she has HIV/AIDS. It could be that she has any number of sexually transmitted diseases caused by the rape. Or it could very likely be the stigma that is attached in Africa to people who have been raped. They're doubly victimized because then they're ostracized. And what happens without an education, with poor health, with no means of financial support? These girls drift into poverty. And as I looked at the big picture, I thought, you know what? This is the poster child. This is who we see, and we say, poor Africa. Is this one of the reasons why Africa can't get back on its feet? Is it not time that this was brought to light? 25% of Kenyan girls are in this situation, and 70% of them never report the crime. Why? Because they said if you tell the police, they will re-rape you. If you tell the authorities, they will ostracize you. As I said, they have the laws. There's one that says that if you can prove that a child was raped under the age of 15, the penalty is life in prison. But that's the rub. The laws are not enforced, and the practice of defilement, as they call it, is on the rise. More than 90% of these kids know who raped them. It was their father, their uncle, their neighbor, their teacher, their priest, the very people assigned the task of keeping vulnerable children safe. And you know, one of the shelter workers told me a really appalling story. She said, by the way, this is not the only reason to cure themselves of HIV/AIDS, that men are going around raping girls. Men think having sex with a little girl is a sign of being wealthy and stylish. Some of these men are educated beyond the graduate school level, but they want to be first to break the flowers, so they seek out young girls. And we're supposed to say it's none of our business? The kid said to me if it was their father, the breadwinner, who was guilty, even the mother would say, keep your mouth shut, we'll starve to death if your father goes to jail. So one of the workers said to me, it is our African culture. No one wants to associate with anyone who's been raped or who's lived in a shelter. And it's time for us to stand up and say, the shame isn't ours, it's yours. That's one of the chapter titles in my book. But I have to tell you about another kid I met when I was there. Her name's Lookaline. And she was 15 years old. She was 39 weeks pregnant. Her rapist kept her and raped her over and over. And I was dazzled by talking to this kid, because she didn't sound like a victim to me. She sounded mad. She said, and she sounded like a kid who wanted to get even and make change. She said, this happened to me on May the 13th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in the year 2010. She said, this is never going to happen to my sister. This is never going to happen to anyone I know. And, you know, by the way, I phoned the next week after when I got home, and she did have a little girl, and they were both healthy. But I was interested to know what was going to become of Lookaline now. And I used to be a teacher. In fact, I was a phys ed teacher, which has always served me well. I was saying to Carolee in the car, I said, you know, I spent a lot of my time in a war zone where rocket-propelled grenades are flying around. I'm often in a broken building with 30 kids who are scared to death, and I know 300 games, so it's always been as a teacher. But as a teacher, I'm always interested to know, excuse me, what are these kids going to do if they get an education? For all our yelling and shouting about the fact that education is the bottom line, if they get it, what are they going to do with it? And I love asking them, and I love it. Most of them say, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer, I wish I could be this, I would prefer to be that. And I love it when a little 6-year-old girl says, I would like to grow up and be the president of Afghanistan. But I asked Lookaline what was going to become of her. Now remember, this is a test case. She said, the people in the shelter said they'd take care of the baby, I can go back to school. I said, oh, so you're going to go to school, and what do you want to be? She didn't say, I want to be, I wish I could be, I hope to be. She said, oh, I am going to be a poet. A poet? I don't even want my kids to be a poet. With no prompting, she pulls a book out from her. She's sitting on a book. And she said, these are my poems, would you like to hear some? And I recorded this one for the CBC. Here I come, walking down through history to eternity, from paradise to the city of goods, victorious, glorious, serious and pious, elegant, full of grace and truth, the centerpiece and the masterpiece of literature, glowing, growing, and flowing, here, there, everywhere, cheering millions every day, the book of books that I am. She's 15 years old. She is so disadvantaged in every imaginable way. How could she be writing stuff like that? But here was a kid who was preparing to sue her government for failing to protect her. This is how change happens. It takes commitment and colossal personal strength for a girl to tackle the status quo and claim a better future for herself. I have to tell you a little sidebar to this story. It's such a Canadian reaction. It was in another piece I was doing for CBC Radio Ideas and played on the radio. And the next day, a literature professor from the University of Saskatchewan contacted the CBC and said, I will mentor that girl. Now, she had to go through like 87 layers of security. But as you and I sit here tonight, Look-a-Line is being mentored by a Canadian professor who decided she gave a damn about what happened to these kids. I just think it's a deliciously Canadian story. The point of all of this, though, and I'm trying to cut it, but the rest of it's in the book. This is a story about a journey that these little girls are on. Little girls who dare to bust the taboo of speaking out about sexual assault. It's about women lawyers from two sides of the world who came together to support these youngsters in their quest for justice. It's about kids who were told you have no rights and decided, yes, in fact, we do. But it's the pushback reaction every woman on the planet, I think, has been waiting for. Because if those girls were to win, the victory would be a success for every girl and woman in Kenya, maybe all of Africa. So the case went to court on October the 11th, Girl Day at the United Nations. And it did create a hullabaloo of Shakespearean proportions. The lawyers decided they would march from the shelter to the High Court in Meru. They'd march down the main street. And all their supporters decided to march with them. And as they began to march, the kids poured out of the shelter and jumped into the march. And lawyers are saying, no, no, go back, you can't be seen, you're minors, no one can know your name. And the kids said, yeah, nothing doing, we're marching. And the kids walked along, punching their fists in the air, yelling, Hakiyangu, which means this is our story. So they got to the court, and guess what? Of course, the police were guarding the High Court. And they saw this hullabaloo of Shakespearean proportion coming. You know, I said to the guy who told me that's what I was going to praise, you know, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to the rights of women and girls, there's nothing I like better than a hullabaloo of Shakespearean proportion. But the police saw them coming, and they slammed the gates to the court shut. Didn't stop those kids. They were up those gates in 2 seconds. Climbing off of the gates, and all of a sudden, one of them started to laugh. And she called to all the others. All this is on video, by the way. She called to us and said, look, look, the police, the very people who hurt us, the very people who shamed us, the very people who treat us so badly, they're scared of us now. Finally, the gates were opened and the court case began. And on May the 27th last year, the judge made his decision. And those kids won. They won.